So we are back with another episode. I think we're up to number 5, if I'm not mistaken.
AltMed EP number 5.
Yeah, so Mitch Kurtz here with my co-host or sidekick, Andrew Dowling.
Sidekick.
It's actually, sidekick. I'm pretty sure that's it. This is an interesting one. We're going to talk about quite a topical issue, which is cannabis and drug driving and how that is kind of working at the moment in Australia. And thankfully, we have Andrew here with his long history of legal and regulatory background, especially in I would want to say cars and vehicle space, but also in cannabis. So seems quite the intersection for you at the moment.
Thanks, Mitch. I thought you were going to say, and his long history of drug driving offences, but
The pause that I made was just to make sure that I didn't say that part. I didn't want to.
Excellent. Well, and for anyone listening, I do have a clean sheet in that regard.
Never been caught. I tell a lie.
Well,
no, I don't tell a lie. Like, you have never been caught, but like, I'm not trying. Yeah.
No, you were right to say it's very topical because, and I looked this up before, on the 14th of October, 2020. So just recently, the Victorian Parliament passed legislation which will see Victoria become the first state in Australia to allow those who are taking medical cannabis, who have a prescription and who aren't impaired, to drive. So very, very big breakthrough moment. And similarly to when Victoria led the way with access to medicinal cannabis way back in 2016, we can expect to see the other states and territories follow suit here.
I think that was kind of driven, this new initiative, by your mate Fiona Patton.
Yes, those who know me know I'm a very big fan of Fiona Patton, who is a member of the upper house in the Victorian Parliament. She's very progressive in the eyes of some in areas of drug reform. But it's really another sensible policy that she has done a lot of the heavy lifting to bring about. And it's been years and years in the making, because I think the historical context is really just that for so many years, cannabis was, and those having a valid prescription for medical cannabis still were unable to drive even though they weren't impaired, whereas those who had, say, prescriptions for some heavy duty drugs like opioids and benzos and the like, they were being treated differently and were allowed to continue driving. Very big win for her, another one. And look, we still don't have a date that these laws are going to be implemented, but it's expected to be early this year, 2021. So exciting times ahead.
Speaking of benzos, I think you kind of had an experience with that recently, didn't you?
Yeah, opioids actually. So that's true. I had some shoulder surgery and got a prescription for endone to manage the pain. And as someone who hasn't really ever taken opioid medicines, this one really threw me around quite a bit. And I kept thinking, imagine people driving under the influence of this particular substance. Now, admittedly, the starting point for all drug driving laws is that you're not meant to drive whilst you're in an impaired state. But for years there certainly would have been motorists who are being prescribed these strong painkillers, who, subject to their levels of impairment, were permitted to drive on our roads. And I think that it's a bit of a terrifying thought for all motorists. But look, I think that the common thread here is impairment. So as a starting point, you as the driver should know, whether or not you should be getting behind the wheel. But really all these laws do is they say, if you do get behind the wheel and you are being prescribed medical cannabis and you have a script and you feel okay, you're not impaired, then you can drive. So it's really a leveling of the playing field to bring cannabis into the same treatment under the law as those heavy duty prescription drugs that I've just described.
And I think it's also good. We're kind of opening up the conversation now for comparisons with alcohol, in that there's a blood alcohol limit for alcohol, or everyone knows, at least in Victoria, 0.05. I think it's actually higher in other states, isn't it?
Yeah,
Um, but but in terms of having some kind of marker like that, and obviously that'll require more testing and more clinical kind of justification, but having a kind of threshold that we deem, and we're really talking about THC when we're talking about cannabis impairment. Um, I mean, there are other cannabinoids, there's CBD, CBG, other cannabinoids at work, but the one that they're testing for and the one that is really has the causal relationship with impairment, where we're talking about THC here.
absolutely. And it's only THC as far as I'm aware that is tested at the roadside drug testing. So they'll test for the presence of amphetamine, so ecstasy. They'll test for THC, and that's because THC is the psychoactive cannabinoid in cannabis. So it's seen as the part of the plant that will have the greatest propensity to impair your driving. It's currently legal to drive if you've got CBD in your system because it's non-psychoactive.
Is it
But
legal actually?
yeah, it is. It is. But THC not so. And the difficulty there is that there are a myriad of medical cannabis products that contain THC. In fact, it's unless you're taking, say, a CBD isolate in oil, or you're taking a broad spectrum product, you're going to have THC in your medicine. Now, this, of course, these changes won't provide any relief to people who are sourcing from the black market, because part of the defense that will be available to those who are on medical cannabis will be this requirement that you have to have a prescription. So you'll need to be able to evidence the fact that you have a script. So unfortunately, for people who are sourcing um, THC products or products with THC in them from the black market, there's still little relief. And I think this is where looking abroad at perhaps what is happening in other jurisdictions around the world, it might be the way that Australia goes. I briefly saw in an article I was looking at that in the US and Canada, or some states in the US and in Canada, they're looking at introducing, to your point, Mitch, that sort of blood alcohol type of system for cannabis. And if that were the case, then I guess it would be potentially irrelevant whether or not you had a script or not for that product. But that's one direction that it might eventually go in.
It's interesting you talking about the black market not being applicable. I've heard from doctors a bit of feedback that in some cases there's patients who come to them looking for a script for medicinal cannabis, who then go and purchase black market cannabis, that are looking for that kind of, oh, but the doctor's given me, a kind of the permit here, as a type of defense, which is still not actually permissible as far as I understand in the current state. But it's an interesting scenario. How do you think there's any way they can account for that type of scenario, like where they could?
Okay, yeah, that's an interesting point. So, in other words, if you hold the valid prescription, but you're sourcing products from the black market, look, as
Pretty hard to tell from the
it
bleed.
would be, and I would think that just on the face of it, if you have the prescription, any level of THC, is explainable or attributable to that prescription. But it's an interesting point in terms of working out the mechanics of how this will all sort of play out. But I think there's factors for people to consider, which are exactly the same as I guess, the psychoactive impact that alcohol has on we as drivers. So, it's not necessarily just a case of saying, right, well, I've had, um, you know, this amount of THC. It's worth remembering, did you have it on an empty stomach, or, how long has it been since you consumed it? Are you a new driver, or are you a relatively experienced driver? That these sorts of
What
things will,
format did you have
yeah,
it? Was it inhaled? Was it an oil? That kind of stuff. Yeah, for sure. Because you know, it's is a little bit easier with alcohol. You know that you got two standard drinks for the first hour relative to your body weight, and then one every is as a rough guide. It might be a bit more difficult when you have such differentiation in products, where also the method of the pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamics affect things differently depending on if you're having an oil product that you've ingested versus whether a vaporized product or something you're smoking. So
mm,
it's very interesting. Yeah, we know that the inhaled forms, you've got about a 3 to 4 hour window before you kind of would even consider um, looking at a car or getting into one. And then with an oil type product, you'd probably be at least wanting to wait maybe 8 hours or more, depending on the dose and depending on your body weight and depending on how you're affected by it and that kind
yeah,
of.
and that is to say that, for cannabis, as well as, alcohol, or those heavy duty prescription drugs, really, we've all been out with friends and had a few drinks, and then sort of thought, oh, do I leave the car here, or do I drive home? That it's really worth having a sense of, how impaired am I? And really, if you have any doubts whatsoever, you just should not be getting behind the wheel in the first instance,
Is that
regardless
why
of whether or not.
is
What's
that why
that?
you haven't owned a car for years?
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. No, I've never thought to pick it up. It's been sitting outside that pub all these years. Um, no, but I think that people really need to sort of exercise judgment, because the way that these changes might be rolled out, you might have the protection of a prescription and everything like that, and maybe even a letter from your doctor. But you know, you're effectively putting yourself at risk of crashing your car if you get into it and you're under the influence. So I guess my message is, these laws are great because they're going to prevent people who, are validly being treated by their doctor with a medicine, hopefully one that works, but and they shouldn't be sort of arbitrarily punished in a way that those who are on the heavy duty opioid and benzos aren't. But the common sense approach is, don't get behind the wheel if you're impaired. I can only imagine if I were taking a strong THC medicine, that I'd probably be on the Monash freeway doing 18 k's an hour. So
Well, it's
bit of a
interesting you
dead
say
giveaway.
that. It's interesting you say that because that's really one of the funny things about, I think, that differentiates THC or cannabis from alcohol. Like when you're drinking, sometimes you don't. It's harder to notice that you are impaired. I think the nature of medicinal cannabis in general, is that the actual user or patient has more of comprehension that they're impaired. I think it's much more, you're much more aware of the impairment, and you almost compensate for that. Drive slowly or extra cautiously, or super careful to make
Yeah.
sure
You
that
see, roadwork sirens up ahead, and you think it's the cops.
you slow down and park on the side of the road. So I've heard. But yeah, no, it's definitely a very. I think it has a nuanced nuanced kind of point of difference to alcohol in that sense, and
And
definitely.
probably, and of course, amphetamines as well. We should actually, something I'd like to endeavor to do is have a part two to this conversation, where we get someone that knows the science behind how different substances impact our driving performance, and we can maybe, have a discussion further on this point, because I think it's quite interesting.
I thought you're going to try and get a few different people to take different substances and line them up.
Yeah, we're going to run a clinical trial where you'll all be given an 18-wheeler truck, and
I think you might get a higher participation kind of buy-in from the public than maybe potentially some other ones in Australia, at least.
When you say higher participation,
exactly.
you meant greater. Yeah, I see.
Yeah. So yeah, I think one of the main things with THC is we know that the attention is definitely not there for patients who are, definitely under the influence of THC. There's definitely a divided attention. They're not as focused on the road, or they're easily distracted, let's say. And I think that's one of the points that is most dangerous about driving under the influence. And I think that is a very valid reason to have THC as a controlled when you're from the perspective of driving, to safeguard both the driver and others on the road, which everybody has the right to kind of be protected from that, I think.
Absolutely. So and I think this is, Fiona Patton's efforts here. And I am singling her out, even though there are, I'm sure, many others that form part of the lobbying effort that went into it. But she really has been the face of it. And I think it is a common sense advancement for people who are getting a prescription for medical cannabis. But as I say, I think ultimately, if you feel that your driving performance is or could be impaired, you really just shouldn't be, even if you have that protection, because to your point, everyone, the drug, we need to have robust drug driving laws that protect us from people who, through levels of psychoactivity that either distract or impair their driving, make that driver a threat or pose harm to all other motorists on the road. So yeah, I think it's a sensible approach. And as I said at the start of this episode, I think we'll now see other states and territories follow suit, and perhaps the introduction of blood alcohol style limits for cannabis and for THC specifically.
And I think, after speaking to a lot of people, I feel like most people who do take some form of THC as a patient, they tend to stick to, if I'm having THC that day, I don't drive at all that day. I think it's just a safer approach in general. I'm kind of for that. As it currently stands, there is no exemption for medical cannabis for THC in any state. So if you're pulled over, then you have to pass that test, and that could be saliva, it's found in the saliva, it's found in the blood, it's found in the urine, I believe. And so you're really not just putting people at risk and yourself, but you're at the mercy of the law. And that's, so we've all had that moment where you get pulled over by the police, you haven't even had a drink, but you're scared that you'll blow on the
I don't mind embarrassing my twin brother the best of times, but we were once down in Lawn, and we got pulled into there was the booze bus had set up, and my brother pulls up next to the policeman, and he's got the little machine with the straw in it, and he goes, "Yeah, just get you to do one of these," and he gives it to my brother, and my brother just did a huge inhale. He just went like this, and he was at full lung capacity, and the cop said, "Yeah, I actually need you to just breathe out into it." Straight back out into the thing. And he had a blood alcohol level of 0, but I think the cop, it was remiss of the cop not to test him for drugs or other things, because
I was just going to say, I know he's a bit vague, so that was just a normal occurrence for him, but I would have instantly busted out the THC test if somebody did that.
Yeah, amphetamines, all of it. Yeah. But no, so no, I think you're right. And just to that point about any THC detected, and it's a 0 tolerance. That's the same with all controlled drugs, which are tested at the roadside RBTs. And the difficulty there is, we've seen that there are patients who get more of a response with their medical cannabis to, say, a full spectrum product rather than just an isolate in oil. And that typically will contain even trace amounts of THC, which, threatens their ability to drive. So I think this is a sensible path forward, and I really look forward to seeing those changes get implemented into Victoria early this year, and for the rollout to occur potentially across other states and territories in the years to come.
Yeah, and I think that will probably bring us to the kind of closing of this podcast. But I just wanted to visit one point you made, which I'm glad to hear, that it is actually legal to drive on CBD, because I didn't actually know that.
Yeah, my research
Impaired,
tells
correct?
me that minor cannabinoids that aren't psychoactive, I mean, for starters, they're not tested for, so they don't form part of the roadside testing that occurs. But my understanding is they are legal. I mean, I think there is research that's on foot to determine how CBD impairs driving, if it does at all.
Because theoretically, there might be an argument to say that it has some kind of sedative effect.
Mm.
It's certainly in a physical sense, but maybe not in as much of a cognitive sense.
Yeah, look, that was just where I'd gotten up to reading articles from professors. It was Professor Dr. Amy Haley from Swinburne, who's someone who'd actually be great to talk to on this. But yeah, she published a great piece in the Conversation that alluded to CBD being legal for driving. So look, she'd be, yeah, her, or we'll have to get someone on for a part 2 of this discussion to really discuss in greater detail with somebody who actually understands the science, how cannabis and other substances, including those legal ones that we were referring to, other legal ones we were referring to, like opioids and benzos, how they impact driving, because I'm sure they all act in their own nuanced way in terms of interaction with driving performance.
Well, I know that medicinal cannabis, the Centre for Medicinal Cannabis Research and Innovation in New South Wales, stipulates that patients can actually take cannabidiol only medicine as long as they're not impaired. So I do know that that view is held in some parts, but I didn't know that it was maybe kind of nationwide. But it doesn't seem unreasonable, given what we do currently know about it. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see that whole space develop, especially as the primary kind of cause for concern, THC, starts becoming more regulated, deregulated. Not sure.
I'll say regulated, but yeah, we'll put a full stop on this for now. But it's this will be our driving episode part 1, with more to come as the law develops and as we can convince a scientist to come join us for an informal chat to perhaps fill in some of the gaps that we've left.
We'll have to get our charming boots on.
I'll let you lead that one.
Okay, thanks, mate. You wouldn't do so well anyway. So that's right. Excellent. Well, I think this was a great chat.
Yep. As always, thanks, Mitch. We'll pick things back up for another episode of AltMed next time. Thanks so much for your time. Cheers.
Cheers.